In terms of gender and sexuality, fluidity is a phenomenon in which an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity changes over time. It's not the same as realizing that you had mislabeled yourself or been mislabeled by others and coming to a more accurate understanding of your identity. When individuals experience fluidity, they feel that their previous identity was accurate for them at the time, but now it has changed, or maybe been redefined. When it's your sexual orientation that changes, we call this sexual fluidity. In this video, I'll be talking about an often misunderstood topic in LGBTQ identity: gender and sexual fluidity. My name is Miriam, and I'm a behavioral health therapist at Equitas Health. In this video, I'll be talking about an often misunderstood topic in LGBTQ identity: gender and sexual fluidity. In terms of gender and sexuality, fluidity is a phenomenon in which an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity changes over time. It's not the same as realizing that you had mislabeled yourself or been mislabeled by others and coming to a more accurate understanding of your identity. When individuals experience fluidity, they feel that their previous identity was accurate for them at the time, but now it has changed, or maybe been redefined. When it's your sexual orientation that changes, we call this sexual fluidity, and when it's your gender, that's gender fluidity. Most research on fluidity focuses on cisgender women and sexual orientation, and has repeatedly found that cis women are much more likely to experience sexual fluidity than cis men. There's less research on gender fluidity, as well as sexual fluidity in trans individuals. But at least in my experience as a therapist, I can vouch for the fact that many different types of people experience fluidity in a variety of ways. We don't really know much about why fluidity occurs and why it seems to be more common in certain types of people than others. Some research points to biological factors, but most likely it's a combination of that and sociocultural influences. Individual personality and experience can play a role too. As someone who has worked with hundreds of people going through all kinds of different stuff, I think that in general, our minds are so much more complex and weird than we often give them credit for. And honestly, I'm not surprised that fluidity is a thing. I'd be more surprised if it weren't. Although folks in the LGBTQ community are talking about fluidity more and more these days, it can still be a divisive topic for several reasons. One is that it challenges one of the most pervasive scientific theories and cultural messages about gender and sexual orientation: the idea that we are born this way. This narrative has been promoted by many in the community as a way to seek acceptance for LGBTQ individuals. We can't help it, the message goes. We were born this way. Gender and sexual orientation are fixed, biological, and that's why it's both impossible and ethically wrong to try to change them through abusive practices like conversion therapy. In the last few decades, there's been an explosion of research that seeks to find genetic, neurological, and otherwise fixed explanations for why we are who we are when it comes to gender and sexuality. Of course, many people have pushed back against this narrative, including lots of people who don't fit into the new norm of the white, cis, middle-class, monogamous, gay or lesbian couple who just wants the same rights as everyone else so that they can live happily ever after in marital bliss or whatever. Though nothing wrong with that if that's your jam. But folks who disagree with the born this way narrative say that LGBTQ people should be celebrated, not merely tolerated or accepted, not because we didn't choose to be this way and can't change it, but because we're integral, fully valid aspects of human diversity. These activists have a compelling question for us to ask ourselves. What if being gay, or bi, or queer, or trans were a choice? And what if we chose to be this way? But of course, the fact that sexuality and gender can be fluid and can change over time doesn't mean that we can forcibly change them. Conversion therapy is still wrong, and would be wrong, even if it worked, by the way, and we still have way less control over our minds than we like to admit sometimes. Fluidity also doesn't prove the conservative talking point that LGBTQ people brainwash children or turn them gay or trans. I mean, if we had that power, then never mind. There's another reason that fluidity is still sometimes stigmatized in the LGBTQ community, though, and this one has less to do with what straight cis people believe about us and more to do with what we believe about ourselves. Individuals who identify outside of the gender binary or who experience attraction to people of more than one gender are sometimes stigmatized as not really trans or not really queer. Some people within the community still stereotype bisexual people as being undecided or as being actually gay men or straight women who just haven't figured that out yet or are faking for some sort of reasons. I'm not actually really sure what those reasons might be, to be honest, given that bisexual folks are at a higher risk for just about every type of violence, health problem, psychological issue, discrimination, and so on. But hey, I'm just telling you what people say. Given that bi or pansexuality is often involved in the sexual fluidity journey, that can make fluidity a contentious topic in a community that's still trying to fight biphobia and panphobia. After all, if sexuality is fluid, someone who identifies as bi today really might end up picking a side at some point in the future. Or maybe their current identity really is just a phase. But then again, that lesbian or gay man whose identity you might assume to be totally fixed and stable might also end up identifying as bi or pan one day, or some other way. And if they do, so what? That still wouldn't justify invalidating anyone's identity in the present moment. After all, if I love chocolate ice cream today, but next week I realize that I'm kind of over it and prefer strawberry, did that mean I was a fake chocolate ice cream lover? Sorry for the hacky analogy, but honestly, that's how folks sound sometimes. With gender fluidity, too, there can be a sense that people's identities aren't valid, and therefore there's no need to worry about their pronouns just because they've changed before and might change later. Some people who experience gender fluidity respond to this by actually choosing gender fluid as an identity label. Others don't. Anecdotally, I've noticed that many trans people who go through medical transition presenting very masculine or feminine later end up adopting a more fluid identity, playing with their presentation, or even identifying as non binary. I'm sure this happens for a variety of reasons, one of them being the increased validation and even gender euphoria that comes with transition. All of these experiences are valid. It costs us nothing but a bit of effort to change the names and pronouns we use for folks if that's what they need. In her research on sexual fluidity, the psychologist Lisa Diamond identified three main ways that it can show up. These three are non-exclusive attractions or behaviors, a change in sexual orientation, or attraction to the person, not the gender. We'll get into what that means a bit later. So, non-exclusive attractions or behaviors describes experiences in which an individual identifies a particular way, but sometimes has feelings or desires that fall somehow outside of that identity. For instance, a cisgender woman who identifies as a lesbian might occasionally be interested in men and might even have some relationships with men. An asexual person might experience sexual desires sporadically towards certain individuals. One interesting thing that Diamond found in her research with women is that of the women who changed their sexual identity labels over the course of the study, most changed it in the direction of less exclusivity. For instance, going from identifying as straight or gay to identifying as bisexual, questioning, or undefined. Their patterns of attraction seemed to broaden over time, not narrow, but some did experience the opposite effect. The second type of fluidity, changes in sexual attraction, describes experiences in which people feel that their sexual orientation has actually shifted over time. So, for example, rather than being like a lesbian with exceptions, someone like this might start to identify as bi or pansexual, and they would still feel that in the past they were a lesbian. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Diamond's research found no evidence that people could choose or control these identity shifts. For some individuals, the change happened more than once, sometimes back to the original identity, but more often to a different third one. The last type of fluidity is one that a lot of the participants in Diamond's research referred to as being attracted to the person, not the gender. For some people, this experience is actually part of a stable or long-lasting identity. They might identify as pansexual, queer, or undefined. For others, though, It was actually a one-time experience in which they became attracted to or even fell in love with someone of a gender that they didn't consider themselves attracted to in general. For these individuals, they might continue identifying with the same label that they did before, but with an expanded definition of what that means. Or they might choose not to use a label at all. For gender fluidity, there are some similar patterns that folks can experience. Some people may find that their gender identity shifts over time. Others may have exceptions or ways in which they play with gender that might seem to be outside of the bounds of that particular identity. For example, someone who uses a different name and pronouns and presents differently in a particular context. If you're experiencing sexual or gender fluidity for the first time, you might be confused or even anxious about it. I hope the information I've presented here today helps reassure you that this experience is completely normal and part of the beautiful spectrum of human gender and sexuality. But, it's also okay to just feel weird about it. One suggestion that's honestly good for all of us to keep in mind is a concept that I call holding your identity lightly. This means that while we may use labels and identify in particular ways, it's smart to try to keep a loose grip on these words and not cling to them if they've outlived their usefulness. Shedding a label that no longer fits can be painful and can even trigger some feelings of grief, but holding on to it hurts more in the long run. Remember, identity labels exist to work for us. We don't exist to work for them. Try to bring an open-minded curiosity to your self-explorations and practice examining thoughts and feelings without hanging on to them for dear life or immediately chucking them across the metaphorical room. This brings me to a related concept. The map is not the territory. This phrase refers to the idea that identity labels are like maps that we create to help us find our way through the territory, which is our actual lived experience. A map can never be a perfect representation of the landscape that it represents. If it were, it would be a life-size model that would simply cover that landscape and would therefore be completely useless. Maps always shrink things down, hopefully to scale, and leave out many details. The question is the map useful? Do you need to redraw it? If you do, try not to be a perfectionist about it. It doesn't have to represent the territory perfectly because it literally cannot. A useful map is one that helps you find the way, or shows others how to find the way to you. Experiencing fluidity is a great opportunity to take out that crumpled up roadmap you've been carting around in the glove compartment, smooth it out, and examine it critically. If it's out of date, what needs to be updated to help you find your people, or to help your people find you? If a loved one is experiencing fluidity and you're just kind of like, what is going on? The above advice also applies to you. Try to give your loved one the space to figure things out and seek support from someone else if you need it. If it's a partner who's experiencing fluidity, you might worry that their fluidity will cause them to stop being attracted to or interested in you. But keep in mind that as far as the research goes, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that sexual or gender fluidity commonly causes people to lose interest in their current partners. In fact, it seems much more likely to happen when they become attracted to someone who didn't previously fit into how they experience attraction. That being said, the fear that a partner will lose interest in us is, well, pretty universal, and it can happen for so many reasons that have nothing to do with identity. I think that to some extent, living with that fear is kind of part of being a human who loves other humans. But if you find that it's interfering with your life, it may be time to seek out some professional support if you can. If you're interested in learning more about sexual and gender fluidity, I recommend Lisa Diamond's book, which is called Sexual Fluidity: Understanding Women's Love and Desire. For gender fluidity specifically, there's a really lovely workbook called the Gender Quest Workbook, a guide for teens and young adults exploring gender identity. Despite the subtitle, though, it can be helpful for people of any age. My hope is that with time, we'll get more and more comfortable talking about these types of experiences, and folks who go through them will feel less alone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being you.